Good afternoon. This is Media Center, Ukraine, Odesa, and we start today with the briefing dedicated to the events of the 26th of February last year. Attorney Ilya Haldai represents the interests of Valery Pronka, territorial defense soldier, which is now defendant in the court case. And the attorney will now share the position of the defense. And we're also having with us Ms. Alexeyeva, Director of Consultative Center Rights and Freedoms of Ukrainian Defenders. We actually invited the representatives of the Specialized Prosecutor's Office who are responsible for the case in the court. And after I give floor to our guests, I will read their explanation why they cannot attend the briefing. So, Mr. Haldai, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. I would like to thank all the present here, and I would like to thank Media Center Ukraine Odesa to share their position about this case. Can you hear me now? Yes. Just speak a bit louder. I would like to welcome all those who are present here, and I would like to thank for having this opportunity to explain our opinion about the case. And I believe that this is an indicative case, and it requires public attention. Unfortunately, the cases when the servicemen are persecuted are quite frequent, and the number of cases is increasing. There are a lot of servicemen, there are a lot of cases when they use weapons, and it is very important for the state to properly investigate these cases because this affects the morale of defenders and the possibility of protecting our country. We know that there is the armed aggression now against Ukraine, and the lives of many people have been divided before and after. And for Valery Pronka is not an exception. He is a volunteer. He first joined the territorial defense units, and then he was enrolled in the armed forces of Ukraine as the motor operator. And if you remember, there were a lot of events in February last year. The Zmyny Island was captured, and people united in territorial defense units to protect their state. The event for our interest took place on the 26th to 27th February, when the group of foreign citizens were detained at the border with the unrecognized Transnistria in Odesa Oblast. There were created several teams of territorial defense soldiers with the involvement of the State Border Guard Service and other representatives of law enforcement bodies and police that patrolled the area. And so they tried to identify the saboteurs, and during the detention of one of the group, a weapon was used. And on the night of the 27th of February, the State Border Guard Service informed about the risk of illegal border crossing on Transnistrian section of the border, and the information was reported in mass media and in numerous Telegram channels. A group of people tried to cross the border at Kuchurgan, BCP. This is the border between Ukraine and Moldova, namely the unrecognized part, which is Transnistria. That was during the curfew. According to operative information and intelligence, there was a group of saboteurs and two groups of territorial defense soldiers, together with the State Bodyguard Service and police, arrived there to detain them. There were more than 30 persons there. There were several cars near the border, and these people first presented their documents for verification, and they tried to flee. The bodyguard officers weren't about using a weapon. The shooting started during detention of that persons. Valery Pronko was the person who used weapon, and some of the foreign citizens there were shot, and one of them died because of the heavy bleeding. What is the problem of the case? First of all, the prosecutor's office and law enforcement bodies, they did not try to find out why that group of people was at the border, or why they tried to flee. And actually, the witnesses say that the shooting was from both sides. Pronko was the driver of one of the vehicles, and he decided to use his weapon when he saw that another territorial defense soldier was wounded. And he left the vehicle, and he tried to detain the mentioned persons. He first shot in the air, and actually, at that time, there was chaotic shooting from both sides. But we don't know why, but the prosecutor's office tries to find the escaping code, despite the fact that there are evidence that allow to have different versions of what happened. The ambulance arrived, and there was an attempt to give first aid to persons. One of the persons was taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, he died there. So no one has left the spot, and the group of soldiers continued their operations during quite a long period of time. And despite the fact they knew there were criminal proceedings, they continued their service, and they did not even try to avoid any investigative activities. Unfortunately, the prosecutor's office from the very beginning stated that these are criminal events, that this is the intended homicide, and they registered the case basing on this information, despite the fact that there was the curfew, there was the war, and that the people, that the trespassers tried to flee, they illegally stayed on the territory of Ukraine, and they had reasons to avoid contact with the law enforcement officers, and they also had a motive not to share their documents to avoid consequences for them. 4 persons were injured, but the general amount of people at PCP amounted to 30 persons, as evidenced by many witnesses. But the prosecutor's office did not take any step to identify the whereabouts of these persons afterwards. They didn't try to check if that people were involved in the case, if they had weapons. So all this evidence was ignored by the prosecutor's office and pre-investigative bodies. Mr. Pronko is a serviceman who could continue defending his homeland, and his unit was involved in hostilities in Kherson and Donetsk oblasts. His unit also serves in Bakhmut, and some witnesses of the case were killed while defending their homeland. Mr. Pronko informed the court and law enforcement bodies about his readiness to continue service in the army, but he was ignored. I would like to focus on this because, on the one hand, we see that the state uses quite a wide range of means actually to recruit people to the armed forces of Ukraine. There are even amendments to the law that allow to delay their criminal proceedings. But in this case, we can see that the situation is different. They want to blame Pronko, and these events are too much criminalized just to blame a serviceman. Unfortunately, the use of weapons cannot be avoided during the war, and it will continue with the war. The assessment of the actions taken by the military should be balanced according to the law, and it should be, first of all, clear to the military, because such cases, they de facto paralyze the activities of military units. Because those servicemen who are aware of such cases every time should take into consideration that any case of using weapons can lead to criminal proceedings during or after the war, and these are severe cases because weapons were used against people. The prosecutor's office has self-eliminated in terms of amendments to the criminal code when it comes to military immunity. These conditions are just neglected by the prosecutor's officer, and actually the whole case is perverted. They try to find just a scapegoat, and I believe that this is the main public problem. Because we should not allow the prosecutor's office to make servicemen a scapegoat. It should give a proper legal assessment. And I believe that in this case, there were used weapons to detain persons. Because, and I would like to repeat it, these persons were the persons tried to illegally cross the border with Ukraine. They illegally stayed on the territory of Ukraine, but the prosecutor's office somehow ignores the evidence. And over the whole process, we can see that the prosecutor's office is just afraid to provide proper legal assessment. It intentionally criminalizes the whole case. Without any proper legal evidence. That's it on my side. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask them. Now, we should first reach the position of the prosecutor's office. We've addressed the specialized prosecutor's office of the southern region, which is responsible for criminal proceedings at court, representing the state prosecution. And they quickly responded to us, saying, and I would like to quote this, taking into account the circumstances of the event and its consequences, the preliminary out-of-court discussion of such materials may later be assessed as an illegal influence on the independent and objective consideration of the case in court, end of quote. I can only call the journalists to attend court proceedings, and there you will be able to get information from both sides, and you will be able to properly cover the case, showing both positions. And Oksana, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. Unfortunately, this situation is not an exception, and it's not only a local situation. I cannot now give the assessment of activities of the prosecutors or investigators in terms of the properly collected materials. I can say that this event took place when the serviceman was performing his duties. Unfortunately, our country has never seen before the war, and our court system has not been adjusted to such cases. That's why our military, our servicemen, unfortunately suffer from this. I've learned the materials of the case, and since 2014, a lot of servicemen have been addressing our center with the same cases. When, while being on duty, when having specific orders from the command, when performing certain instructions, they became hostages of our legislation. Because during consideration of the case, they face this. I cannot now say if these people are criminals or not. I can only say that in such cases, servicemen performed their duties, which were obligatory. I don't know if there is a complex psychological expertise of these servicemen. This was the night of the on the 27th of February. Let us remember what happened on the 24th of February, what happened in different Ukrainian cities. And we have a great example of the events in Kiev back then. Every person, every man, every woman tried to protect their homeland and to prevent the entry of the enemy to our cities. And back then, the cars of officials could be stopped to check if there was enemy or not. That's why we should properly consider this case, if it's an intended homicide or not. Of course, if this serviceman was at home having his gun under the pillow and he started shooting, then of course this is one case. But when the serviceman is on duty, when he's on his shift, when he arrives to a spot and sees there that some unknown people use weapons during the curfew, and of course he can consider these people trespassers and criminals. And that's why I would like to bring your attention to this case. Because we can see such cases all over the country. And of course, this affects the moral and psychological state of our servicemen, because now they ask us questions. After there will be criminal proceedings after the victory, and then they will not be considered as defenders, but they will be considered as killers. That's why our state, our society should pay attention to such cases and to adjust our law enforcement and court system accordingly to take into consideration all the elements of the events. And now the questions. First, don't forget to use the mic and don't forget to introduce yourself. I have a question. This is Dumska. Gennady Kulikov, Dumska. I have a question to Ilya Haldai. You are now saying that on the other side there was shooting, and I have a question to you. Is there the weapons found that were used by the other side? This is the first question. And so, is there's other weapons found of the other side? And you've also reported about one more circumstances, that the fellow soldier of Valery Pronko was also injured. Gennady, thank you for your questions. All these questions are organic, and actually every person independently assessing the situation has such questions. I would like to say that right after the event, the police, the state security service, and the high-rank soldiers that were in that area arrived to the spot at once. All units on service were there. They were representatives of the National Police, the State Security Service. Perhaps they were representatives of the prosecutor's office, but we don't have official records of that. The people who were illegally staying on the territory of Ukraine were not detained. And so these persons are unidentified now. No one knows what they did there during the curfew and where they fled. And actually now the question of used weapons from the other side cannot be answered now. Events were not registered and were not recorded, despite the fact that there was the violation of the state border during the curfew under the martial law. And I would like to remind that on the 25th of February last year, the head of the regional military administration ordered to introduce the curfew on the territory of Odesa Oblast, and the document had been already into the force. And so there were legal bases to detain the persons because they were staying outside during the curfew. But law enforcement bodies self-eliminated from these activities. There were no procedural actions taken to identify those persons, to identify their legal status. There were no attempts to find weapons and ammunition of those persons. So they found some cartridge cases there, but they were not thoroughly checked. Everything was made to blame the servicemen in question. The people who joined the territorial defense units, and there were several territorial defense units teams, means that there were objective circumstances to use weapon. There were two teams in Rozdilna district who patrolled the area. And they received information that there was a big group of people who attempted to cross the border. That's why an increased number of soldiers was required to detain that potential saboteur group. And the servicemen just fulfilled the order to patrol that area. So they were ordered by the National Police to patrol the area to ensure public order during the curfew. But no actions were taken to ensure objective investigation. The third question about the wounded soldier. Yes, there was the person injured, and that what before my defendant started using weapons. And he did not try to avoid the pre-court investigation. He participated in interrogations. He gave explanations during the investigation experiment. So he did everything possible to support the investigation. The same can be told about his fellow soldiers. They provided all explanations of that situation. My defendant was a driver, and he saw that one of the servicemen was wounded in his leg, and he was taken by his colleagues, and that was the serviceman Chernohor, if I'm not mistaken. And this person is known. He was interrogated by the prosecutor's office, and actually the prosecutor's office wanted to blame Valery for wounding that person as well. There are other questions. I have an online question. And could you be brief, because we are running out of time? And additional questions can be discussed later. This is the question from journalist Vera Zaporozhets. What is the legal qualification the defendant believes fair? And what is the position of the injured? And I would like to thank Vera for that question. Objectively, there was the fact of exceeding measures needed for detention. But unofficially, I've heard from representatives of the prosecutor's officers. I don't want to name them now. Unfortunately, there is in the prosecutor's office there is still fear to properly qualify the case. If the liability is less than objectively can be established, because they are afraid that the prosecutor's office improperly investigate cases. It is obvious that they were exceeding measures during detention, but the prosecutor's office offer more severe qualification, not to be blamed for corruption, or not to be blamed for decreasing qualification, because exceeding measures envisaged around 3 years of imprisonment. And the legislative bodies envisaged the specific circumstances for detention. And this person was a serviceman. He was giving a weapon or a gun in his military unit. Back then, he was patrolling the area together with the national police. His comment proves that they also gave them order to patrol the area. That there could be the illegal crossing the border. The information was published by mass media. And that there were preliminary shooting in the area, and this can be proved by all witnesses. Was there ballistic expertise proving this? The ballistic expertise examined only 3 bullets that were found in the bodies of killed persons. And perhaps if they were provided proper first aid, they could survive. I would like to come back to my clarification question about ballistic expertise. Only 3 bullets were examined, but when they were shot first from the gun, the ballistic expertise cannot tell us about the sequence. It can also just trace the gun, and also to examine cartridges. And so they can just investigate the bullet and the barrel to identify the gun. But all the witnesses say that the other side also used a weapon, and actually they were the first to shoot. And the last question, we have only 5 minutes. And Ilya, we have only 5 minutes. I would like to answer the question of Vera Zaporozhets. Unfortunately, no one saw the victims. Some people represent them, but they do not come to the court. And actually, we cannot identify them properly. And there were no claims from the victims. Vladimir Bokic, the People's Bureau of Investigations. In this case, our defendant need help. And the question to Ilya Haldai: why heroes of Ukraine are blamed for such cases? I would like to say that in this case, the hero of Ukraine is an official status. But any defendant of our country is a hero, and I believe in this. And many of us have not joined the armed forces of Ukraine, and that's why I understand that this is the weight decision of every person who has joined the armed forces of Ukraine. And I believe that the state should create proper conditions to properly assess such cases, taking into consideration hostilities, the curfew, and to investigate all the versions. Because the prosecutor's office has quite a formalized approach to this case. Unfortunately, now we still have the system when every person which has claims against is to blame in the court. There should be competition in the criminal proceedings, but the situation is different because the person, the prosecuted person, is taken to the temporary detention centers, and for the prosecutor's office, this person is already a criminal because they just name him a criminal. But unfortunately, they don't try to investigate other versions, and since this demotivates the great number of servicemen. Because when they use weapons, they just afraid that they can be prosecuted after that, despite the fact that they protect homeland. Thank you. That was the briefing of Ilya Haldai, attorney, and Oksana Alexeyeva. As for the events on the 27th of February, and there is the case against the Territorial Defense soldier, which is blamed for intended homicide. And I would like to call the journalists to be present at the court proceedings in Rozdilna. The case was submitted to the court in February this year, and the investigation and proceedings are ongoing, so you still have time to cover the topic. Stay tuned and follow our announcements.
За подібний злочин